I can no longer pinpoint the exact moment when the warmth between us quietly dissolved into routine, nor can I say when the softness of familiarity hardened into silence, but I know with certainty that somewhere along the way, Adam and I became one of those couples who functioned flawlessly on the surface, with smiles rehearsed over morning coffee and weekend plans spoken in neutral tones, as though the house itself had absorbed our unspoken agreement to keep the peace at all costs. Our country home, nestled among quiet trees and white fences, radiated a kind of stillness that outsiders might call comfort, with its clean lines, natural wood, and the faint scent of eucalyptus from an old diffuser that hadn't been touched in months. Yet beneath that polished exterior there lived a hollow rhythm, measured, reliable, and completely devoid of spark, where we moved around each other, like synchronized furniture, never touching, never truly speaking, and never daring to disturb what remained of our quiet understanding. I was setting the table with leftover soup, gently placing the ladle beside Adam's bowl while he sat scrolling through his phone with the same absent focus he gave to every evening meal, when my phone rang from the windowsill, its vibration cutting through the air like a sudden draft, and before I even reached for it, I had a strange feeling that something beyond the routine was about to breach our perimeter. Seeing my sister's name lit up on the screen didn't surprise me, but the urgency in her voice did, especially as she spoke fast and low, saying that Josh had stormed out after a fight with his father, that he wasn't answering his phone, and that she just needed to know if, by chance, he might show up at our house if I could let him stay the night, just until things cooled down. As she spoke, I felt the name, Josh, stir something oddly tender and uncomfortable in me. Because though I hadn't seen him in years, I remembered him as the awkward teenager who mumbled through family dinners with headphones tangled in his hoodie and a permanent scowl that softened only when he smiled unexpectedly, and it was strange now to imagine that boy grown into a man I could no longer picture clearly. I ended the call with a promise that I would let her know the moment he arrived, and when I relayed the situation to Adam, who merely lifted his eyebrows without looking up from the bowl, he said with a shrug that, since he was leaving early for the fishing trip, it was fine if the guy stayed a night, and that it was better than the kid freezing somewhere, and then he returned to his phone like the conversation was already over. By the time the doorbell rang, the night outside had deepened into a snow-filled quiet, and as I walked barefoot across the wooden floor to answer it, I felt that kind of strange anticipation that lives somewhere between memory and instinct. And when I opened the door and saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, with snow melting in his hair and a worn backpack slung low, I realized how little of the boy remained in this man standing silently on our porch. He greeted me with a calm, "Hi, Aunt Scarlett." And although I nodded and stepped aside with a practiced smile, the air between us shifted, not unkindly, but with a certain weight, as though something wordless passed from him to me in that moment, and I watched him enter, remove his boots, place the backpack by the stairs, and scan the room with a quiet familiarity that felt both comforting and slightly unreal. The evening moved in slow, measured beats, with Adam excusing himself early and heading to bed, leaving me and Josh alone in the kitchen, where I poured tea and listened as he spoke about school, about how everything with his father had finally come to a breaking point. And although his tone remained even and steady, I sensed beneath it a current of frustration and self-control that made me study him more closely, noticing how his face had sharpened with age, how his jaw tensed when he spoke, and how his eyes, calm, clear, and observant, looked nothing like a child's anymore. At one point, he made a quiet joke about always being compared to someone from my past, and when I laughed and said he reminded me of Sasha, my first boyfriend, he smiled knowingly in a way that made the back of my neck flush, because it wasn't the joke that unsettled me, but the way he looked at me right after, with a kind of patient stillness that men carry when they know the weight of their presence. Later, when we said goodnight and he climbed the stairs without a sound, I stood in the kitchen a while longer, rinsing already clean mugs and listening to the house settle around me, while a thought, unwelcome and persistent, lingered in the quiet. He wasn't a boy anymore, not in the way he stood, not in the way he listened, and certainly not in the way he looked at me. I lay awake long after the lights went out, with Adam turned away beside me, breathing deep and even, while my eyes searched the dark ceiling and my thoughts drifted to Josh's voice, his shoulders, his hands wrapped around that mug of tea, and though I tried to tell myself I was only worried, that I was being ridiculous. The truth hummed low beneath my ribs, loud enough to make me restless. Then came the sound. Slow, almost hesitant, the creaking of the wooden stairs beneath careful feet, and in the dark, I stopped breathing, because in that exact moment, I understood that someone was walking downstairs, and I didn't know what he was looking for. But I knew with absolute clarity that I wasn't ready for him to find it. I stayed frozen in the dark, eyes wide open against the ceiling I could no longer see, but even without light, I could feel the shift in the air, the heaviness that followed those cautious footsteps as they moved across the hall and toward the lower level, one creak at a time, each one growing softer as the distance between us widened. Yet instead of relaxing, my pulse only quickened, because part of me had expected the stillness of the night to return immediately, but it didn't. It lingered, stretched, expanded into a kind of breathless space that no longer felt entirely safe or innocent. I waited for the sound of the refrigerator door or the faucet, or even the shuffle of his socks on the tile to break that silence, to anchor me in the idea that this was normal, that he was just thirsty or couldn't sleep and needed a moment to clear his head. But instead, all I heard was the low hum of the heating vent and the echo of my own heartbeat bouncing between my ears, and that was when I pushed back the blanket, carefully, slowly, not wanting to wake Adam, whose back remained turned, undisturbed by any of this. My feet touched the floor like they were made of glass, every movement deliberate, every breath measured, and as I stepped into the hallway, I realized I hadn't even put on a robe, that I stood there in just a thin cotton nightgown that reached barely to my knees, and for a fleeting second I hesitated. But the need to know, to see, to make this real, outweighed any modesty or logic that might have stopped me before. I descended the stairs with the same care I imagined he had used just minutes earlier, keeping close to the wall, letting my fingers trail along the railing, each step deliberate and silent, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see the faint blue light bleeding across the tiles from the open refrigerator, casting its soft glow into the otherwise dark kitchen like a single spotlight on a still and waiting stage. There he was, standing with one hand on the door, and the other holding a glass, his head slightly turned as if he had already heard me long before I arrived. Not startled, not surprised, but simply aware. As though my presence had been expected, even summoned. And when his eyes met mine across the cool distance of the room, something subtle and unmistakable passed between us. Something wordless that neither of us dared name. I cleared my throat softly, almost out of habit, and said, "Couldn't sleep either." My voice barely above a whisper, yet steady enough that I surprised myself, and he gave a small nod, replying that the house was too quiet, that he wasn't used to the sound of trees moving like that, which made me smile despite the way my stomach twisted with every second we stood there together under that quiet blue light. He closed the refrigerator and stepped away, his bare feet brushing the floor soundlessly, and as he poured water into the glass and handed it to me without asking if I wanted it, I felt the warmth of his fingers against mine for the briefest moment, and in that accidental contact there was a kind of static charge, something small and sharp and entirely inappropriate, but real nonetheless. I sipped the water slowly, not because I was thirsty, but because it gave me something to do, something to hold between us that wasn't silence. And when I looked up again, he was still watching me, not boldly, not with challenge or expectation, but with that same calm, unreadable expression that had unsettled me since the moment he walked through our door. "I used to hate how quiet it was here," I said finally, breaking the silence just enough to make it bearable. "When we first moved out of the city, it felt like the silence was a sound by itself." And he nodded, leaning slightly against the counter, arms folded, eyes still steady, and answered, "It doesn't feel silent to me. It feels full," which made something tighten low in my chest because I knew exactly what he meant, even if I couldn't explain why. We stood there a moment longer, not moving, not rushing, and then, as though some invisible line had been drawn between us and both of us had agreed not to cross it, I set the glass down carefully and whispered, "You should get some sleep." And he nodded once without argument, pushing off the counter with that same slow, confident ease that made him look older than 21, then turned and walked away, without a word, leaving me alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the soft hum of the fridge and the sudden ache of what had not happened. Upstairs, I slipped under the blanket without waking Adam, curling onto my side and facing the window, where the moonlight bled faintly through the curtain, and I stared at the pale gray line along the floor and thought about nothing and everything, all at once, about time, about aging, about how quickly people change and how strange it feels to be reminded of your own past by someone who wasn't part of it. The room around me seemed smaller than before, or maybe it was just me who had expanded, filled now with something restless and alive that hadn't stirred in years. And though I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, like someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to want, I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, his hands, or the way the silence between us had felt full, not empty, and that single, maddening thought came back again and again. He isn't a boy anymore. The next morning began in a haze of routine, with the sound of Adam's suitcase wheels brushing along the floor and the soft creak of the front door as he stepped outside, casting one last glance toward the staircase as if half expecting someone to descend and say goodbye. But Josh remained, upstairs, silent and still, and I merely waved from the kitchen, holding my coffee with both hands and forcing a soft smile that belonged more to habit than sincerity. Once the car had disappeared down the gravel driveway, swallowed by a curtain of light snow, the house fell into a quiet that felt thicker than before, not empty exactly, but too still, as if something behind the walls was listening. And as I rinsed the mugs in the sink, the faint thud of footsteps overhead signaled that I was no longer alone, a realization that made me straighten my back and smooth my hair without really knowing why. Josh turned toward me slowly, meeting my eyes with a steadiness that made it hard to breathe, and said with a quiet certainty that didn't try to comfort, didn't ask for permission, "If I were him, I'd still be looking." And before I could respond, before I could decide whether to laugh or scold or deflect, he set the towel down, walked out of the kitchen, and disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there with my hand still on the counter and a knot tightening slowly in my chest. The day passed in fragments, filled with mundane tasks. I used to do on autopilot, but now every motion felt watched, even when I was alone, and by the time the evening settled in and the windows turned dark against the snow, I found myself choosing a movie at random, not because I wanted to watch anything, but because I didn't want to sit in silence, and when I called out to him that something was on, he came without hesitation and sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our arms nearly brushed. I didn't move away, didn't lean back, or shift to make more space, because in that moment, space felt like something unnecessary, something that belonged to a different version of myself. And as we sat there in the glow of the television, saying nothing, pretending to be focused on a story we weren't really following, I became aware of the slow rhythm of his breathing and the quiet gravity of his presence beside me. We watched, until the credits rolled, until neither of us had anything left to pretend we were looking at, and as I stood to stretch and said goodnight over my shoulder, he waited until I reached the top step before saying that he was glad he hadn't gone. To the dorm, after all, that this felt better, warmer somehow, and I answered with a quiet, "I'm not." But even I didn't believe it. From behind me came his reply, soft and sure and without accusation. "That's a lie." And I didn't turn around, didn't answer because I knew he was right. After his words fell into the stillness behind me like a stone into deep water, I didn't move, didn't breathe for several long seconds, as if standing still could somehow make the moment less true. But my body betrayed me, warm under the thin fabric of my sleep shirt and alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear, only with the slow, unrelenting realization that something between us had already changed. And no matter how carefully we stepped now, there was no returning to the space we had shared just 24 hours ago, when he was still just a guest, and I was still just a woman hosting her sister's son. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, fingers still curled around the handle as if anchoring myself to the cool metal might somehow quiet the rising hum under my skin. And when I finally crossed the room to climb beneath the covers, I found that the sheets no longer offered their usual comfort, that my own breath felt too loud in the dark, that the memory of his voice, low, certain, impossible to laugh off, echoed louder than any sound the wind or the house could make. I turned my face into the pillow and tried to summon images of ordinary things, shopping lists, folded laundry, the drip of the kitchen faucet Adam had never gotten around to fixing. But every thought slid sideways, reshaped itself into the curve of Josh's shoulder as he leaned back on the couch, the slight movement of his jaw when he chewed in silence, the way his eyes didn't flinch when they met mine and held them just long enough to make me forget I was supposed to look away. The night passed slowly, the kind of long where time folds in on itself and the hours feel sticky, indistinct, suspended in a kind of charged air. And though I don't remember falling asleep, I must have drifted at some point, because I woke, suddenly in the early blue of morning, startled not by sound, but by the clarity of a dream I couldn't fully remember. Only the heat it had left behind in my chest, in my throat, in the trembling hollow of my stomach. When I made my way downstairs, later than usual, the house was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way it sometimes could be. It was a silence that felt taut and watchful, and I moved through it carefully, making coffee with slow, deliberate motions, listening for footsteps, for any sound that would ground me back, into something normal, something simple and explainable. He entered the room without announcement, barefoot, wearing an old sweatshirt he must have pulled from his bag, sleeves rolled to his forearms, eyes still soft from sleep, but steadier than mine, and when I greeted him with a light "morning," he returned it with a voice that stayed close to the chest, as if neither of us wanted to disturb the fine thread that now hung between our words. We moved around the kitchen together like people who had done it before, passing plates, wiping counters, standing close without touching, and though there was no conversation, no pointed glances or smiles heavy with meaning, I felt everything sharpen inside me with each accidental brush of an elbow, each moment where the silence didn't break but deepened. Eventually, he leaned against the island with a half-finished cup of coffee and asked, not as a provocation but as a quiet continuation of everything left unsaid, if I had always felt that distance in my marriage, or if it had crept in slowly like fog through the trees, and I hesitated before answering, not because I didn't know, but because saying it aloud would mean I could no longer pretend it hadn't been there all along. Told him that it hadn't always been this way, that in the beginning there was warmth, there was laughter, even surprise, but over time the looking stopped, and when a man stops looking at you, not just seeing, but truly looking, it leaves a part of you unlit, like a room you don't enter anymore but still keep clean out of habit. He set his cup down, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the sound to land with meaning, and said in the same tone he'd used before, the one that never sought permission, "I'd look at you every day." And then he left the room again, same as before, same slow steps, same silence in his wake. But something in me no longer felt the same, because this time I didn't want to let the moment pass unspoken. The rest of the day moved around us like scenery we watched through a window, distant, muted, unreal, and I busied myself with the kind of tasks that fill time rather than serve purpose. Folding linens that didn't need folding, rearranging cookbooks on a shelf I hadn't touched in months, all the while acutely aware of his presence somewhere nearby, not hovering, not pressing, but present in a way that made every sound he made, every door, every sigh, feel like a line drawn closer. When evening came, I told him we could watch another film if he wanted, and he agreed without looking at the title, sitting next to me just as he had the night before. Only this time the space between us narrowed, not by decision but by something quieter. And when his arm brushed mine, I didn't flinch, and when he didn't pull away, I didn't either. By the time the credits rolled and the screen dimmed to black, we hadn't spoken, but it felt as though something had already been said, and when I stood to head upstairs, he remained where he was, looking not at the television, but at me. And when I turned at the top of the steps, he said with a quiet certainty that didn't ask for a response, "I'm glad I stayed here," and I answered automatically, "I'm not." But the words didn't hold, not in the air, not in my mouth. He smiled then, not wide, not playful, but real, and said the word like he already knew the truth of it. Lie. And I didn't argue, didn't deny it, because for the first time in years I was tired of pretending I didn't want to be seen. I woke to the sound of music I hadn't heard in years, soft and slow, carrying from the living room with the kind of intimacy that made it feel like the house itself was humming, and as I lay beneath the blanket, not yet ready to move, I let the melody wash over me with its minor chords and deliberate pauses, each one landing like a breath held too long before release, and only when I began to hear the words, quiet, raw, sung low and without performance, did I realize what it was about, because the lyrics, mournful and plain-spoken, circled around loneliness, about not knowing where you belong, about standing in the middle of a room and feeling like no one sees you, and something in the unguarded way he played, in the slight catch of his voice on the second verse, reached straight into my chest and touched a place I had spent years trying not to visit. I didn't go downstairs right away, choosing instead to sit at the edge of the bed with my hands curled around a mug of lukewarm tea I hadn't finished the night before, staring out the window at the trees bending beneath the wind, while the music beneath me grew quieter, then stopped altogether, and I found myself disappointed by the silence, as though the room had exhaled too deeply and left me emptier than before. When I finally made my way into the kitchen, he was already there, barefoot and reading something on his phone, with that same quiet presence he always seemed to carry like a coat that never wrinkled. And though we said our good mornings like ordinary people, neither of us looked the other in the eye for more than a second, as if whatever had passed between us the night before had rearranged the air around us and we hadn't yet figured out how to breathe in it. Throughout the day, the energy between us remained taut and unspoken, threading through each room and trailing behind every moment of contact, no matter how fleeting, and though nothing was said aloud, I felt it when his hand brushed against mine as I passed him a cup of coffee, and again when I reached to open the cabinet just as he stepped beside me, his arm grazing my shoulder with a heat that lingered even after he moved away, and each time it happened, my breath caught in my throat before I could steady it. At one point, as I handed him a dish towel without thinking, he took it with a half smile and glanced at my hand, then back at me, saying softly and without irony that I had beautiful hands, hands like someone who once painted. And though I tried to laugh it off, something in the way he said it, something quiet and admiring, made my face flush with a warmth I hadn't felt in so long that it almost startled me, and I turned away before he could see what it had done to me. By evening, the sky had darkened into a heavy gray that seemed to press down on the windows, and when the lights flickered once, then again, and finally cut out entirely, the silence that followed was thick with wind and the soft thrum of tree branches tapping against the walls, and though the moment should have been inconvenient, I found myself moving almost automatically, reaching for the drawer with the candles, finding matches, lighting one, then another, until the room glowed with a soft gold that smoothed every edge and made the house feel smaller, closer, warmer than it had in months. He appeared beside me without a word, holding 2 glasses and a half-empty bottle of red wine I'd forgotten we had, and we moved into the living room where the fireplace still held a bit of warmth from the morning, and without speaking, we both sat on the floor, not too close, but not far either, the flicker of the candles casting shadows on the rug, while the storm gathered behind the walls like a breath waiting to break. We talked first about nothing, about the weather, about an old film we both remembered differently, about the way time blurs around the edges when you're not looking, and then slowly, gently, the conversation slid into places we hadn't visited before, into the kinds of things people only share when there's no expectation of being judged. And when he told me that he had always felt like a guest in his own house, that no matter how old he got or how hard he tried, he never felt wanted where he came from. I listened without interrupting because I understood more than I wanted to admit. I told him that long before my marriage dulled into silence, there had been moments I thought would shape me into someone I could admire, that I had once been full of color and recklessness and a desire to make something lasting, but that somewhere between compromise and responsibility, I had misplaced myself in the details, and though he didn't answer right away, he reached for his glass and stared into it like it held something he couldn't say, then spoke the words that cut straight through the comfort of the moment. "If I weren't your nephew." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to, because the pause that followed was enough, and I felt it as a weight in my chest before I replied, not flippantly, not carelessly, but with the same quiet honesty. "And if I weren't married?" And that was when he turned to me fully for the first time all night, his eyes locked on mine, neither hesitant nor bold, only open, and when he reached up and touched my cheek with the back of his fingers, I didn't move away. The moment his fingers brushed my cheek, I didn't flinch or lean away, not because I had made a conscious decision to allow it, but because I didn't step back. Not because I had decided, but because the moment carried its own quiet momentum, drawn to the warmth and quiet intent behind his touch, and as he looked at me, not searching for permission but anchoring himself in the space between us, I felt something in me soften, something I hadn't realized had been clenched tight. For years, and when I tilted my face ever so slightly into his palm, the silence around us shifted from something neutral to something charged, as if the house itself recognized that the line we had walked so carefully was no longer holding. He leaned closer in slow, steady increments, not with the urgency of someone trying to take, but with the awareness of someone who knew that what he was offering might still be refused. And even though my breath shortened with each inch that narrowed the distance between us, I didn't pull back, didn't speak, didn't stop him because the question had already been answered long before his lips reached mine. He leaned in slowly, not with urgency, but with a quiet presence that asked nothing and lingered in silence, the kind of kiss that listens before it speaks. And though my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could feel it where our bodies nearly touched, I matched his pace, letting myself be guided without needing to be held, letting the rhythm build slowly like a thread being pulled gently loose. And in that quiet unraveling, I felt the weight of all the months and years where I had gone unseen dissolve between us, replaced by a warmth so steady it frightened me. His hand, steady and grounding, shifted gently to rest at the back of my neck. Not rushed, not unsure, just present, just deliberate enough to keep me from slipping too far into my own doubt. And as our mouths moved together in that slow and suspended gravity, I forgot where I was, forgot the candlelight, the storm, the fact that this was not a dream, but something very real. His closeness still lingering in the silence between USL, and when his other hand rested gently at my side, I felt something shift inside me before my thoughts caught up with the moment, leaning into him with a trust I didn't remember granting. We stayed like that for what felt like a suspended minute inside a much longer moment, a space where nothing else existed but the tension that had finally broken and the aching gentleness with which we met in it. And when he finally pulled back, not abruptly but gradually, with lips that lingered and a gaze that didn't drop, I felt the coolness of the room return to my skin as if I had just stepped out of something warm and sheltering. For a long second, we didn't move, didn't speak, and I could feel my heartbeat all the way down to my fingertips as he looked at me with a question he didn't ask. And though I knew in that moment I could have crossed the rest of the space between us with a single breath, I also knew that doing so would unravel everything too quickly, too soon, and that the heat we had touched would turn sharp if we pushed it beyond what it could bear. It wasn't fear that made me hesitate, nor shame, nor regret, but the quiet realization that something real had happened, and that rushing it now would only undo the careful honesty that had allowed it to unfold in the first place. And I saw the same thought settle in his eyes just before he gave a slow, steady nod and stepped back, his hands falling away from me with the same care with which they had arrived. Neither of us apologized or explained or tried to name what we had just shared because there was nothing to fix and no damage to conceal, only the undeniable truth that a boundary had been touched with reverence, not broken in haste. And as I stood slowly and gathered the empty wine glasses, my fingers trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the way something in me had awakened, something I didn't realize was still waiting. I told him quietly that I would head upstairs and left before either of us could say something that would try to wrap a bow around the moment, because it didn't need closure or interpretation. It needed to breathe in the silence we had built for it. And as I climbed the stairs, candlelight flickering along the walls and the wind still pushing softly against the windows, I felt my skin pulsing with the echo of what had passed between us, something that settled into the room like a truth we couldn't unsay. In the hallway, I paused at the door to my room with my hand resting on the knob, heart still pacing inside my ribs as if it hadn't yet decided whether it belonged to me or to something larger. And though my fingers wanted to turn back, to reach again for the warmth I had just left behind, I pushed the door open slowly and entered the room, letting the quiet wrap around me like a question I wasn't yet ready to answer. I didn't sleep for a long time, lying in the dark beneath a blanket that felt too heavy and yet not heavy enough, staring at the ceiling as if the shape of my thoughts could be made visible above me, and when I closed my eyes, I didn't dream of anything dramatic or dangerous, but of the way his eyes had softened when our lips met, of the way his breath had slowed to match mine, and of the feeling, not of guilt, but of something far more dangerous, of being wanted again. The morning after felt as though the entire house had exhaled and then refused to breathe again, because every room I stepped into carried the kind of silence that didn't soothe or comfort, but pressed down with the weight of something we both knew and neither of us would name. And as I moved through the kitchen preparing coffee with mechanical precision, I listened for footsteps that never came, for a voice that didn't rise behind me, while he stayed upstairs longer than usual, as if stretching the boundary between last night and today might somehow reverse the thing that had already been set in motion. When he did finally appear, barefoot and quiet, his hair still tousled with sleep, and his expression unreadable in that way that made me wonder if men could teach themselves to forget on command, he didn't mention the kiss, didn't glance too long, didn't acknowledge the way I paused slightly when our eyes met over the rim of my mug, and instead asked whether there was any bread left, as though we had simply skipped a beat in a normal week and could now fall back into casual small talk without disturbing the surface of what lay underneath. Responded with a nod that felt stiff in my neck and a few words about the sourdough being in the bottom drawer of the fridge, my voice too calm, too even, the kind of careful tone one uses when trying to prove a lack of feeling rather than admit to it. And I noticed how he too avoided every unnecessary word, how he chewed slowly, how he kept his focus on the table and never on me, as if by not looking he could help me pretend nothing had happened. Later, after the plates had been rinsed and set aside, I stepped onto the back porch with my phone pressed tightly to my ear and called Adam with fingers that trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the strain of needing to sound normal, and when he picked up with his usual distracted greeting, I told him everything was fine here, that the wind had knocked out power for a bit, but it came back, that Josh had helped find the candles, and that the house felt quiet and restful. But even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the too perfect rhythm of my own voice, and wondered if he heard it too. The walls between us, so thin in this old house and thinner still after everything we had already allowed to pass between us, felt less like a barrier and more like a veil that could be lifted at any moment. And though I never moved, not even an inch, I imagined myself crossing that line, imagined the quiet thud of my feet on the floor, the soft turn of the doorknob, the stillness on his face when he saw me, and the way his hand might reach toward mine, steady and certain like it had that night beside the fire. But instead I stayed where I was, gripping the edge of the blanket like an anchor, my body rigid but burning, because even in his silence I could feel the pull of him, the gravity he carried simply by existing outside my door, and no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in reason or restraint, the memory of his voice and the weight of his gaze returned again and again, not as guilt, but as a question I could no longer avoid. The minutes passed like beads slipping slowly through fingers, and when I finally heard his steps again, soft, careful, beginning to retreat down the hallway, I turned my head just enough to catch the shift of light under the door, the momentary shadow of his feet as he moved past, and even though I should have felt relief, should have exhaled and allowed my heart to slow, the space he left behind only made the silence more unbearable, more hollow. I knew he wouldn't try again, not tonight, that whatever he had been listening for he had already heard in the shape of my breath, in the way I had failed to call out, and as I stared up into the dark, my body still humming with the electricity of withheld motion, I began to understand that this wasn't something I could silence or postpone, that I was standing on the edge of a decision I could no longer pretend wasn't mine. Outside, the wind pushed against the glass with long rising sighs, as if the night itself was leaning in to listen, and I closed my eyes only to find that his image followed me there as well, his face in the soft gold of candlelight, his voice low and honest in the space between questions, the warmth of his hand on my cheek, and the way he had looked at me, without shame or hesitation, as though he had nothing to fear from the truth. I shifted slightly, rolling onto my side, pulling the blanket tighter around myself in a way that felt at once protective and uncertain. And though my skin still carried the residual chill of the sheets, there was a slow-burning heat underneath, not just in my body, but deeper. In the part of me I had buried beneath years of quiet compromise and emotional silence. And now that it had been stirred, it refused to settle. Every breath I took felt louder in the dark, sharper around the edges, and I imagined how it would have felt if the door had opened, if the steps had reversed, if instead of walking away, he had entered without saying a word and waited outside the door. Quiet, like he didn't want to intrude but didn't want to leave, not because we lacked control, but because neither of us wanted to keep pretending we had never already crossed the line. But he hadn't come in, and I hadn't asked him to. And that space between our choices became the place where all my thoughts turned restless, feeding on the tension of restraint and the unbearable clarity of desire that no longer felt inappropriate, only unspoken. And as I lay there wide-eyed and unmoving, I realized that I didn't fear what we had done nearly as much as I feared what we hadn't. I waited for sleep, hoping it might offer escape or at least the illusion of stillness, but it never came, only fragments of thoughts dressed as memories. His voice asking if I regretted it, my own answer trembling in the space between honesty and fear, the heat that bloomed under my skin when he stood too close, the tremor in my fingers when he touched my face, and the weight of his footsteps as they faded slowly into the quiet. Hours passed like breath held too long, and I didn't move, didn't reach for my phone or the lamp or anything that might break the illusion that I still had control over this feeling, because deep down I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, but a kind of awakening, something undeniable that had been waiting for the right silence, the right spark, the right man to ignite it. When dawn finally arrived, it didn't come with peace or forgiveness, but with that same heavy stillness, as if the house itself had heard every unspoken thought and now held its breath waiting to see what I would do next. And as I blinked into the pale light, still lying in the exact same position as hours before, I knew with painful certainty that something between us was no longer waiting. It was already happening, and it was only a matter of time before we stopped pretending otherwise. That night the house was steeped in such stillness that even the wind outside had quieted, and I lay in bed unable to sleep, not because of noise or restlessness, but because something inside me had begun to vibrate at a frequency I couldn't lower, a restless current beneath my ribs that wouldn't quiet, no matter how still I lay. No matter how still I lay or how tightly I curled beneath the covers, and though I had turned off the light and closed my eyes more than an hour ago, I hadn't once drifted towards sleep. Only floated in that suspended space where thought folds in on itself, and the body becomes painfully aware of its own hunger for something unnamed. It must have been well past midnight when I heard it, the softest creak of floorboards, the slow, deliberate cadence of feet moving carefully through the hallway outside my door. And I didn't need to look at the clock or even hold my breath to know it was him, that Josh was awake and walking without direction, and before I could question my own response, I had already pushed the blanket aside, already opened the door with slow, soundless precision, already stepped into the dim corridor and met his eyes in the low light that spilled faintly from the window at the far end. Neither of us said anything at first because there was nothing uncertain between us anymore, no lingering doubts or veiled glances or cautious silences to pretend we didn't understand. And when I nodded toward my room and turned without waiting, I felt his presence follow with such gravity that my spine tingled as if my body had already made peace with the decision my mind had not yet named. When he stepped inside and closed the door behind him with the soft click of finality, we didn't rush toward each other like people overtaken by impulse, but instead lingered in the gentle haze of anticipation, talking first about nothing, about how the wind had changed direction, how the wine from yesterday had tasted too dry, how the heater had clicked too loudly around 3 a.m. as if even the machines in the house couldn't sleep. And each casual exchange between us only tightened the space we were pretending not to collapse. He said something dry about the old armchair in the guest room being harder than the floor, and I laughed not because it was funny, but because it felt so tender to have levity shared in a room already vibrating with everything unsaid. And when I looked up at him, still smiling, still caught in the middle of that warm breath of laughter, he was watching me in a way no one had in a decade, not with desire alone, but with a kind of reverent focus that made me want to cry and reach for him at the same time. He stepped closer without speaking, his movements slow but confident, as though he knew the time for uncertainty had passed, and I didn't move away, didn't brace or question or analyze, because something deeper than thought had already decided for me. And when his hand lifted to brush a strand of hair away from my face, my eyes didn't close and my shoulders didn't flinch. I simply let him touch me as if I had been waiting for exactly that sensation, that hand, that moment, for longer than I could admit. When he kissed me, it wasn't hesitant or rushed, but soft and open. The kind of kiss that holds you in place and undoes you from the inside. And when I answered it, when I leaned into him and let my hand rest gently on his wrist, grounding myself in a moment that felt too big to carry alone, I felt him exhale into the space between us like the last. Resistance had finally left his body, and mine responded by folding into his in a rhythm older than memory, and more honest than anything I had spoken aloud in years. His fingers found my shoulder with gentle pressure. He stood so near that the space between us seemed to disappear, the moment thick with quiet meaning, and my hand moved to his back, not pulling, not urging, just anchoring us to the moment, to the silence, to the way his breath trembled when my lips opened beneath his, and we stood like that. Two people forgetting everything except the shape of the other, for what felt like hours compressed into minutes. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath alongside us and could no longer stand the tension, the door burst open with a sharpness that split the air like glass shattering, and before I could register what was happening, the light from the hallway poured across the room in a clean, unforgiving line, revealing the full shape of what we had become. My body pressed tightly to Josh's chest, his hand still at my waist, still leaning into each other, caught in a closeness that hadn't yet broken its rhythm. In the doorway stood Adam, motionless at first as if his mind refused to give shape to what his eyes had already seen, and the seconds that followed felt stretched beyond time, filled with the pounding of my heart, the weight of Josh's stillness, and the stark silence of a world that had suddenly turned too loud. He didn't shout or break anything or even step into the room. He simply stood there, pale in the frame of the door, looking not at Josh, not even truly at me, but through me, into me, with a stare that carved something out of my chest. And when he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise or shake, but dropped low and flat, saying only, "I trusted you, Scarlett." And then he turned and walked away with the heavy rhythm of a man who had stopped carrying hope. He walked away slowly, with the kind of steps that make no sound and still carry weight, and though I wanted to call after him to explain something, that didn't have words. My throat closed around the truth so tightly that even breath became difficult, and the only thing I could do was stand completely still in the dim light. With Josh's arms still around me, and the echo of Adam's words cutting through the room like a bitter wind that stripped away everything that had once felt safe. Josh moved first, not quickly or clumsily, but with the same careful, almost reverent energy he'd held all along, stepping back just enough to give me space, his hands falling from my body like he knew exactly what had changed but not yet what it meant. And when he said my name, softly, as if speaking louder might cause something to break, I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because the gravity of the moment had hollowed out my ability to think or feel anything coherent. I stood there with my arms at my sides, eyes fixed on the empty doorway, the space where Adam had just been, and even though he was no longer there, I could still feel the weight of his stare, the force of his disappointment pressing into my chest like a second heartbeat that wasn't mine but that still pulsed through me. And all I could do was walk across the room in a slow, detached rhythm and close the door with a quietness that made the silence afterward even more unbearable. When I turned around. Josh was still standing in the same spot, his face pale and unreadable, his body caught between instinct and restraint, and though he didn't try to come closer, I could see in his eyes a flicker of something that almost looked like regret. Not for what we had done, but for the way the world had caught us mid-breath, with our hands still open and our guard completely down. I walked past him without speaking, every movement deliberate and small, and sat on the floor beside the bed because I didn't trust my knees to hold me upright. And as soon as my body folded down and my arms wrapped around my legs, something inside me began to tremble. Not violently, not in panic, but in a quiet, deep rhythm that felt like grief, like a breaking apart of everything I'd spent years building to keep myself whole. I pressed my forehead to my knees, not to hide from him or to disappear, but because the weight of what had just happened felt so total, so absolute, that I couldn't hold my head up under it. And though no one spoke, and nothing moved, and the night outside remained dark and indifferent, I knew without question that a line had been crossed in a way that could never be undone. The morning after everything collapsed began without voices, without questions, without even the hollow performance of two people pretending to exist in the same space. And when I stepped quietly into the hallway just after sunrise, I saw Adam already dressed and standing near the door with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his posture rigid but composed. And though he didn't look at me for more than a few seconds, his eyes were dry and steady, as though whatever grief had tried to surface during the night had already been folded back into him and buried beneath layers of resolve I could no longer reach. He didn't ask for an explanation or offer one of his own, didn't demand words or gesture toward anger, but simply opened the door, stepped through it, and closed it behind him with a finality that rang louder than any argument we might have had. And I stood in the stillness he left behind, not crying, not moving, not even thinking clearly, only absorbing the absence he had carved into the morning like a hollow echo that kept returning each time I tried to breathe. It was 2 days later. As I sat outside on the wooden steps drinking cold tea from a chipped mug and staring at the gravel path that led nowhere I wanted to go, when my sister called without warning, her voice low and too measured, the kind of careful tone that always preceded something she didn't know how to phrase directly. And after a pause longer than necessary, she said that she had spoken to Adam, that he was staying with a friend in the city, that he'd already spoken to a lawyer, and that the papers had been filed quietly, efficiently, without discussion or confrontation, and that I should probably expect a call sometime soon. I didn't ask her how she knew or whether she had offered him comfort or advice, because none of it mattered anymore, not the details or the justifications or the way people around us might try to construct a narrative that made sense from the outside, because the truth was simple and heavy and already finished. My marriage had ended not in a storm, but in a silence so deep it could no longer hold the weight of what we hadn't said. After that, I moved through the house like a ghost assigned to inhabit my own body, washing dishes I didn't remember using, folding laundry that smelled like no one, opening the windows to air out rooms no one would enter, and pretending that the quiet around me was peace instead of aftermath, until the day I walked into the study and found a small stack of folded clothes and a duffel bag by the wall, and realized that Josh had come back at some point when I hadn't been home, had collected only the things he needed, and had left, without a note, a message, or a trace of explanation, as if removing himself from my life might restore balance to a world we had already dismantled together. There were no messages, no late-night texts or vague apologies, no digital ghosts lingering in unread threads, only the sharp, cutting silence of a bond severed by shame. And though part of me tried to be grateful for the clean break, for the absence of temptation or confusion, another part resented how easily he had left me here, standing in the ruins alone while he returned to his world, untethered, unnamed, and untouched by the aftermath I still had to live inside. When my sister called again, her voice carried the tremble of questions she wasn't ready to ask directly, and though she danced around the topic, mentioning how Adam had seemed strange, how he wouldn't say much, how something about his expression unsettled her, I pretended not to hear what she was implying. And when she finally said, "Did something happen between you and Josh?" I answered quickly and without hesitation that it was nothing like that Adam had been distant for a long time, that things had been falling apart for years, and that maybe this was just the inevitable end of a quiet crisis we had both ignored for too long. She didn't believe me completely. I could hear it in the pause that followed, in the way her voice softened as if preparing for disappointment. But she didn't press further, and I ended the call with the kind of practiced calm I had developed over the years, the one that let me hold everything inside without letting anything break the surface. Josh stood there in the same jacket he had worn the last time I saw him, but without the guarded expression, without the weight of silence behind his eyes, and though his face was unreadable, his posture held something steadier than uncertainty. And when we looked at each other for the first time in what felt like an entire season, I realized how much he had changed, not just in the days apart, but in the way he now stood in front of me like a man who had chosen to return, not stumbled back by accident. He didn't ask if he could come in, didn't explain why he was here or what he wanted from me, but instead stood beneath the gray porch light and asked in a voice low and clear, "Do you want me to disappear?" And the simplicity of that question, the way it cut through every story I had rehearsed, every imagined outcome, every defense I thought I'd need, unraveled something so quickly in me that I had to lean against the frame of the door to steady myself before I could find the words. I looked at him, not as the boy I once helped raise, not as the man who had undone me with a single kiss, not even as the stranger who had walked away without a trace, but as someone who had stood exactly where I had stood these past weeks, inside the wreckage of a decision that had cost more than either of us had expected, and I answered him honestly, without flourish, without apology. No, but I don't know how to live past this. And even as I said it, I felt the truth of it echo through my ribs. He didn't flinch, didn't try to soothe or contradict or fix, but nodded slowly like he had already considered this possibility, like he had practiced this moment in his mind 100 different ways and was now ready to let it unfold without needing it to follow a script. And after a moment, he stepped closer, close enough for the space between us to hold something heavier than silence, and said quietly, "Then maybe we start from scratch, or at least from somewhere honest." I didn't answer right away because I didn't trust my voice to hold steady, didn't trust my hands not to reach for him too quickly, didn't trust my mind not to sabotage the moment with everything it still carried, so instead I stepped aside and let the door open wider, just enough for him to see the empty hallway behind me, the coat still hanging by the stairs, the light still dim above the kitchen where the apple lay half peeled, and he understood without needing an invitation that I wasn't ready for anything except to not be alone anymore. We didn't talk much that night, didn't touch, didn't try to rewrite anything or reframe what had happened, but sat across from each other with warm mugs between us, and the space filled not with guilt or longing or expectation, but with a tentative stillness that came not from distance, but from two people learning to breathe again after standing too long in the fire. Later, after he had gone, promising nothing, asking nothing, only offering presence in the softest, least demanding way, I walked slowly upstairs, not because I was tired, but because I needed the quiet ritual of movement to bring me back into my own body, to remind myself that I still lived here, that this was still mine, even if the shape of my life no longer resembled anything I once recognized. I entered the bathroom, washed my face in cool water, pinned my hair back from my forehead with an old clip I found beside the sink, and changed into a plain shirt and worn jeans that fit my frame without clinging, not because I wanted to look composed, but because I wanted to feel like I belonged to myself again, not to memory or regret, or to someone else's story about what kind of woman I had been. In the hallway mirror, I barely recognized the face that looked back at me, not because it was older or paler or more tired, but because it was finally still, finally quiet, finally unmasked by all the performing I had done for years to hold a marriage together, to preserve an identity that no longer felt true. And I stared at her, this version of me, for a long time without looking away. She didn't smile, and didn't cry, didn't ask for permission, and didn't explain herself, but stood there with her back straight and her eyes clear, and though the woman in the mirror wasn't the one who had first come to this house or who had once imagined love, as a safe, quiet thing, she was still here, and more than that, she was breathing.